Christ hangs above a chessboard, not suspended from the two rough beams a carpenter in first-century Judea would have lashed together, but held in space by something stranger, a cross built from 8 cubes, unfolded flat the way a child takes apart a cardboard box and lays it open on a table. Below him, a woman in a rust-colored dress stands with her back to the viewer, looking up from a stone quay where 2 small fishing boats rest against a bay, so still it looks poured rather than filled. There are no nails, no crown of thorns, no wound opened in the side. Blood does not touch the canvas anywhere. The body does not hang so much as float, weightless against a sky the color of an eclipse, dark at its outer edges and burning pale gold where it meets the horizon. In 1954, in a small fishing village on the Catalan coast, Salvador Dalí finished a painting he titled simply Crucifixion, though the world has since come to know it by the name he gave it in private, Corpus Hypercubus. Historians have spent decades explaining what this picture is about: faith, geometry, the Spanish Baroque tradition Dalí spent the second half of his life trying to revive. What they have spent considerably less time explaining is how a painter, with no university training in advanced mathematics, constructed, with total geometric accuracy, an object that professional mathematicians using computers would not fully catalogue for another 30 years. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Look again at the cross beneath Christ's floating body. 8 cubes make up its structure, not 2 beams. Arranged in a pattern that resembles a plus sign stacked on a plus sign, 4 cubes forming a vertical column and 4 more branching outward at odd, deliberate points. To a viewer in 1954 walking through a gallery, this would have registered as strangeness for its own sake, one more of the impossible objects surrealism had trained audiences to expect, from the man who had already melted clocks across a Catalan landscape and set elephants on spider legs. But this particular arrangement of cubes follows a real mathematical structure, rather than an invented one, a net in the precise sense that 6 squares hinged correctly can be folded into a cube. Dalí had drawn, by hand, with drafting tools and no computational aid of any kind, one of the valid 3-dimensional unfoldings of a 4-dimensional hypercube, a shape mathematicians call a tesseract. To understand why that matters, it helps to walk backward 1 dimension at a time. A single point has no dimension at all. Drag that point through space and it traces a line, 1 dimension. Drag the line sideways and it sweeps out a square, 2 dimensions. Lift the square upward and it sweeps out a cube, 3 dimensions, the shape of a die or a sugar cube or a room. Mathematicians in the 19th century, working through the logic rather than the experience of geometry, asked an obvious question. What happens if you drag a cube through a 4th spatial direction, one that does not exist anywhere a human body can stand or a human eye can look? The answer is a tesseract, a 4-dimensional cube, a shape that cannot be built, held, or fully seen by anyone confined to 3 spatial dimensions. The way a 2-dimensional creature living on a sheet of paper could never fully see a cube, only its cross-sections and shadows as it passed through the paper's plane. What such a creature could do, however, is unfold a cube's shadow into 6 flat squares and study the pattern, the way a person unfolds a cardboard shipping box to see how its 6 faces were once connected. That is exactly what Dalí painted, not a hypercube itself, which cannot be rendered on a flat canvas any more than a sound can be painted, but its unfolding, 8 cubes hinged along their faces in a configuration that, if a 4th spatial dimension existed and you could fold along every hinge simultaneously, would close into a genuine tesseract with every face meeting its correct partner. The world that produced this canvas was not a peaceful one. Dalí spent the early years of the 1940s in exile in the United States, having fled Europe as the continent tore itself apart, and by the time he returned to Spain in 1948, the country he came back to and the world beyond it had been reorganized by a single event. In August of 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Dalí, along with a great many artists and intellectuals of his generation, treated the news less as a political catastrophe than as a metaphysical rupture. He would later write that the atomic explosion of August 6, 1945, shook him to the core of his being, and that from that date forward, the atom became his primary subject. He called the period that followed his nuclear mysticism a phase in which he tried to fuse the findings of modern physics, the discontinuous, granular, probabilistic universe that quantum mechanics had revealed beneath the smooth surface of appearances, with the certainties of the Catholic faith he had abandoned as a young surrealist and now spent his final decades trying to reclaim. Where his early work had mocked religious iconography and delighted in shock, his work of the 1950s turned toward crucifixions, madonnas, and sacraments, rendered not with the crude anti-clerical irony of his youth, but with an almost obsessive technical reverence for the old masters he had once dismissed. He studied Vermeer's handling of light. He studied Zurbaran's austere, sculptural drapery. He studied Velázquez, whose own late religious works he considered unmatched, and whose Christ Crucified, painted in 1632 and held today in the Museo del Prado in Madrid, presents a crucified body of such restrained, almost geometric stillness that later historians have long treated it as the closest precedent for the composed, unstrained figure Dalí would eventually suspend from his own cross of unfolded cubes. This return to faith was not simply private. In November of 1949, Dalí traveled to Rome and was granted a private audience with Pope Pius XII, to whom he showed a new painting, the Madonna of Port Ligat, depicting Gala as the Virgin, seated in a stone niche with a suspended egg above her head and a fractured, floating architecture around her, the same visual language of objects held in tension against gravity that would culminate 5 years later in the Cross of Cubes. The audience was, by most accounts, a success. The Vatican did not condemn the work as blasphemous, and Dalí, who had spent 2 decades as a professional provocateur, found himself in the strange position of being received, however cautiously, by the institution his earlier art had gleefully offended. The surrealist movement he had once belonged to did not extend the same welcome. André Breton, the poet who had led the surrealist group since its founding, had expelled Dalí from its ranks in the mid-1930s, over disagreements both political and personal, coining an anagram of his name, Avida Dollars, greedy for dollars, a jab at what Breton saw as Dalí's willingness to trade radical politics for commercial success. By the 1950s, the rift was permanent. The Parisian avant-garde that had once celebrated Dalí as one of its own now treated him as a defector, a populist entertainer who had abandoned the movement's revolutionary seriousness for gallery sales and magazine covers. Dalí, characteristically, appeared untroubled by the exile. He had Gala, his wife and manager since 1934, whose business instincts had shaped his career as much as his own talent had, and he had Port Ligat, the small fishing village on the Costa Brava, where the couple had built a rambling house from a cluster of old fishermen's huts, and where the calm bay visible beneath Christ's floating body in Corpus Hypercubus is, in fact, the actual view from Dalí's studio window. The specific form the cross took in Corpus Hypercubus was not an invention born purely of intuition. Dalí himself pointed to a source, a slim and little-read treatise written in 1589 by Juan de Herrera. The architect King Philip II had commissioned to design El Escorial, the vast granite monastery palace outside Madrid that remains one of the defining structures of Spanish classicism. Herrera, alongside his architectural career, wrote a work called Discurso de la Figura Cúbica, a discourse on the cubic form, in which he treated the cube not merely as a building block of masonry, but as a geometric expression of divine order, a shape whose proportions he believed encoded theological truth, the way a psalm encoded praise. Herrera's treatise was obscure even in its own century, more philosophical meditation than engineering manual, and it had gone almost entirely unread outside a narrow circle of Spanish architectural historians by the time Dalí, 4 centuries later, cited it as the intellectual scaffolding for a painting about a mathematically unfolded fourth-dimensional Christ. It is a strange kind of lineage, a counter-Reformation architect's meditation on cubes feeding directly into a 1950s surrealist's argument that atomic physics and Catholic transcendence describe the same underlying structure of reality, but Dalí drew that line himself, deliberately, and named his source. He had another guide as well. In the 1930s, Dalí had become acquainted with Matila Gica, a Romanian diplomat, novelist, and mathematician, whose 1931 book, Le Nombre d'Or, The Golden Number, and later work, The Geometry of Art and Life, argued that the golden ratio and related proportional systems appeared throughout natural growth and classical art as evidence of a hidden mathematical order beneath visible form. Gica's ideas shaped Dalí's later work in ways that extended well past Corpus Hypercubus, most visibly in The Sacrament of the Last Supper, painted the following year, in which the entire composition is inscribed within a giant, luminous dodecahedron, a 12-sided solid, Gica had specifically associated with the golden ratio and with the structure of the cosmos. Between Herrera's cube and Gica's dodecahedron, Dalí had assembled, from a 16th century Spanish architectural treatise and a 20th century Romanian mathematician's proportional theory, a genuinely serious geometric education, one he pursued not as an academic requirement, but as a private obsession pursued alongside his painting. The accuracy of what he produced from that education went unconfirmed through his own lifetime, and the confirmation, when it eventually arrived decades later, came almost by accident. A four-dimensional hypercube, like an ordinary cube, can be unfolded into three-dimensional space in more than one way. Just as an ordinary cube has 11 distinct valid nets, 11 different arrangements of 6 squares that will fold up correctly into a cube, and no other number will. A tesseract has vastly more. In 1984, the mathematician Peter Turney used a computer program to systematically search every possible way of unfolding a tesseract's 8 cubes and arrived at a final count, 261 distinct valid nets, catalogued and published for the first time, with the certainty that only exhaustive computation can provide. Among that catalogue, 30 years after the fact, sat the exact cross-shaped arrangement Dalí had drafted by hand in his studio at Port Ligat, using pencil, straight edge, and a treatise written before the telescope had been invented, arriving independently at one correct answer out of 261, without the benefit of a single calculation a computer could perform. Thomas Banchoff, a mathematician at Brown University, who became one of the pioneers of computer-generated visualization of four-dimensional objects, spent much of the 1970s building some of the first moving images of a rotating tesseract, collaborating with the computer scientist Charles Strauss to render on screen what Dalí had rendered by hand 2 decades earlier. Banchoff met Dalí in person in 1975, and the two spoke at length about the fourth dimension, hyperspace, and the mathematics of unfolding. Banchoff has since described the encounter as a meeting between two people who had arrived at the same geometric territory from opposite directions, one through rigorous formal training and early computer graphics, the other through intuition, classical draftsmanship, and a 16th century architect's forgotten treatise on cubes. Corpus Hypercubus was not an isolated event in Dalí's output of this period. 3 years earlier, in 1951, he had completed Christ of St. John of the Cross, a painting that solved a different but related problem: how to depict the crucifixion from an angle no crucifixion had ever been painted from before, looking almost straight down on Christ's head and shoulders from somewhere above and behind the cross. The harbor of Port Ligat spread out below like a map. The composition was not purely Dalí's own. He based it on a small pen and ink sketch preserved in the Convent of the Incarnation in Avila, traditionally attributed to the 16th century Carmelite mystic St. John of the Cross himself, who was said to have drawn the crucifixion as he had seen it in a vision, from above rather than from the ground, where every other artist in the Christian tradition had stood to paint it. Dalí adapted that 400-year-old mystical sketch using the tools of a modern draftsman, plotting the foreshortened body with the same geometric rigor he would bring to the cubes of Corpus Hypercubus 3 years later, producing an image so technically persuasive that viewers who had spent their entire lives looking at crucifixions from ground level reported the disorienting sensation of seeing the scene for the first time. 2 paintings then, separated by 3 years, both attacking the same problem from different geometric angles, an aerial crucifixion that reinvented the viewer's physical relationship to the scene, and a cross built from an unfolded fourth-dimensional object that reinvented the material the scene was built from. Neither painting arrived at its solution through accident or through the loose associative logic that critics sometimes attribute to surrealism generally, the assumption that strangeness in this movement was simply strangeness, unmoored from calculation. Both were the product of specific, named, verifiable sources: a mystic's 400-year-old sketch in one case, an architect's 400-year-old treatise in the other, filtered through a painter who had taught himself enough working geometry to translate obscure and largely forgotten texts into images accurate enough that a Brown University mathematician would spend an afternoon 3 decades later confirming what Dalí had gotten right the first time. Without a computer, without formal training, and without anyone in 1954 available to check his work. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The woman in the rust-colored dress at the bottom of the canvas, standing with her back turned, looking up at the floating body above the harbor, is generally identified as Gala, the same figure who sat for the Madonna of Port Ligat and for a long run of religious paintings from this period. her face withheld from the viewer in Corpus Hypercubus, the way it is withheld in several other works of these years, present as a physical anchor for the composition rather than as a portrait in the conventional sense. The chessboard pattern beneath her feet is not an invented surface either. It reproduces the stone paving of the actual quay outside the house Dalí and Gala shared at Port Ligat, the same view visible from the window of his studio, meaning the painting fuses three separate registers into a single flat surface. A documented mathematical object borrowed from a 16th century treatise, a documented crucifixion tradition reworked without its traditional violence, and a documented, literal, physical location where the painter actually lived and worked. Little in Corpus Hypercubus, examined closely enough, turns out to be pure invention. Almost every element traces back to something Dalí could point to and name: a treatise, a mystic sketch, a mathematician's book, a harbor outside his own window, which is itself a striking departure from the free associative method that had defined his surrealist decades, when imagery was prized precisely for arriving without a traceable source. Dalí was not the first artist of his century to try to put the fourth dimension on canvas. Long before Corpus Hypercubus, a Russian mathematician and mystic named Peter Ouspensky had published Tertium Organum in 1912, a book arguing that ordinary human consciousness perceived only a limited slice of a much larger, higher-dimensional reality, and that art, mysticism, and mathematics were three separate routes toward the same hidden structure. Ouspensky's ideas circulated widely through the European avant-garde in the years that followed, feeding directly into the fascination with simultaneity and multiple viewpoints that shaped Cubism, and indirectly into Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, a painting built from overlapping, telescoped positions meant to suggest movement through time as a kind of fourth dimension folded into two. What almost none of these earlier engagements attempted, however, was topological accuracy. Ouspensky's fourth dimension was philosophical, a metaphor for expanded consciousness rather than a coordinate system with rules that could be checked. Duchamp's telescoped figure gestured at a fourth dimension of time without claiming any specific geometric correspondence to it. Dalí's cross made a narrower and far riskier claim that this specific arrangement of 8 cubes, hinged at these specific faces, was one of the finite number of ways a real four-dimensional object could be correctly represented in three-dimensional space. It was a claim that could be right or wrong in the same way a proof can be right or wrong, not merely evocative or unconvincing, and for 3 decades nobody, including Dalí himself, had the tools to check it. There is no surviving record of Dalí working with a professional mathematician or engineer during the actual composition of Corpus Hypercubus in 1953 and 1954. No named collaborator credited alongside him, the way some later museum wall texts speculate about other painters of his generation. What exists instead is a documented pattern of self-directed study. Herrera's treatise, Guica's writing on proportion, and Dalí's own working notebooks from the period, which show him sketching cube arrangements and geometric solids repeatedly in the years leading up to the painting, testing configurations the way a draftsman tests a joint before committing it to a final drawing. This matters for how the achievement should be weighed. A painter working from a professional mathematician's finished diagram would be illustrating someone else's proof. A painter working alone from a 16th century treatise never intended as a mathematical guide, and a mid-century book on proportion never intended as a manual for four-dimensional unfolding, arriving independently at a configuration that a systematic computer search would later confirm as one of only 261 valid solutions, is doing something considerably harder to explain by luck or by loose analogy. The gap between an artist gesturing at higher mathematics for atmosphere and an artist getting the mathematics right is the entire distance between Ouspensky's philosophical fourth dimension and Turney's 261 nets, and Dalí is one of the only painters of his century who can be shown, after the fact, to have landed on the correct side of that gap. Return now to the painting itself, having absorbed what the cross actually is, and the image changes in a way that has nothing to do with taste and everything to do with structure. What looked, on first viewing, like one more surrealist flourish, a strange geometric shape chosen because Dalí liked strange geometric shapes, turns out to be load-bearing in the argument the painting is making. Christ hangs from a mathematically verified unfolding of an object that exists, formally and provably, in a dimension no human being can walk into, rather than from wood, the material of an actual first-century execution, or from some abstract shape invented purely for effect. That distinction is the entire thesis of Dalí's nuclear mysticism compressed into a single image. The atomic bomb had shown the world that solid matter, the table you lean on, the granite of El Escorial, the human body itself, was not solid at all, but a probabilistic arrangement of near-empty space, governed by forces invisible to the naked eye. If matter itself rested on a hidden mathematical scaffolding that ordinary perception could not detect, then Dalí's argument was that faith could rest on the same kind of scaffolding, real, structural, verifiable in principle, simply inaccessible to a viewer, confined to 3 dimensions and ordinary sight. The Tesseract cross carries that argument directly, rendered in paint, and it only works because the geometry beneath the paint happens to be correct. A decorative approximation of a hypercube net, close but not quite valid, would have made Corpus Hypercubus a striking image and nothing more, a costume worn by a metaphor. An accurate one, verified independently 30 years later by a mathematician with a computer, makes it something closer to a proof. The absence of the Crucifixion's traditional violence supports the same reading. There is no crown of thorns pressed into the scalp, no nails through the palms and feet, no wound in the side, no blood anywhere on the canvas, a startling omission for a subject that Western painting had spent over a millennium rendering with escalating physical realism, sweat, torn muscle, the particular slackness of a body that has stopped fighting gravity. Dalí's Christ does not sag. He does not strain. His arms rest along the horizontal beams of the cube cross, with an ease that borders on repose, head tilted slightly forward, the whole figure held aloft, as though suspended by an idea rather than by iron. Critics who encountered the painting in the years immediately after its completion were not uniformly persuaded by this choice. Several dismissed the entire nuclear mysticism period as a marketable pose, a wealthy, famous provocateur repackaging himself as a serious religious painter once shock value had begun to lose its commercial edge, and the fact that Dalí unveiled the painting through a gallery opening rather than a church commission did little to quiet that suspicion. The rift with André Breton's surrealist circle had already hardened views on both sides. To former allies who now considered Dalí a defector, a fourth-dimensional Christ dressed in golden light looked less like theological seriousness and more like the same appetite for spectacle that had produced the melting clocks, simply aimed at a different audience. What that contemporary skepticism could not account for, because the underlying mathematics would not be formally catalogued until decades later, was the specific, checkable accuracy of what Dalí had actually drawn. A critic in 1954, evaluating Corpus Hypercubus as spectacle, had no way to distinguish an authentic Tesseract net from an invented approximation of one, because no published catalogue of valid nets existed yet, against which to check the painting's geometry. The verification that would eventually separate genuine mathematical achievement from decorative gesture arrived only once Peter Turney's exhaustive computer search produced its list of 261, and only once a specialist in the field, Thomas Banchoff, sat across from Dalí and confirmed in person that the painter's intuitive grasp of four-dimensional unfolding matched what formal mathematics had independently derived. That confirmation reframes the entire 1950s reception of the painting. The gallery-going public and the critical establishment of Dalí's own moment were, in a real sense, not equipped to judge the specific claim the painting was making, because the tools required to judge it correctly did not yet exist. The painting was, in that narrow but precise sense, ahead of the apparatus available to evaluate it, which is a different and more demanding kind of achievement than simply being ahead of prevailing taste. The painting's companion piece fared differently, and the difference is instructive. Christ of St. John of the Cross was purchased in 1952 by the Kelvingrove Art Gallery and Museum in Glasgow, Scotland, for a sum that provoked immediate public argument, with critics and some fellow artists objecting that municipal funds had gone to a living, commercially successful painter rather than to acquisitions more clearly aligned with established art historical taste. Students at the Glasgow School of Art staged a protest against the purchase. Decades later, the same painting is regularly cited as one of the most visited and most reproduced works in any Scottish public collection, its aerial crucifixion now treated as a settled masterpiece rather than a contested expenditure. The reversal took time, and it followed a pattern that Corpus Hypercubus would repeat on a smaller, more technical scale: initial dismissal from a critical establishment unequipped or unwilling to evaluate the specific formal claim being made, followed by a slower, quieter recognition once the claim could be checked against evidence that did not yet exist at the time of the first reviews. That pattern of delayed evaluation is not unique to Dalí, but it is unusually well documented in his case because his central formal claim in Corpus Hypercubus happened to be one that mathematics itself would later formalize into a checkable, countable, published result. The science writer Martin Gardner, whose long-running mathematical games column in Scientific American introduced generations of readers to recreational and higher mathematics, discussed Dalí's Hypercube painting in the context of unfolding problems and four-dimensional geometry, treating it as a genuine point of entry into the subject rather than as a curiosity from the art world. Mathematics educators have used the same painting in the decades since, projecting it alongside diagrams of Tesseract nets to give students an image to hold onto before they encounter the more abstract coordinate geometry of four-dimensional space. An unusual second career for a painting originally conceived as a private statement of religious conviction, assembled from a counter-Reformation architect's treatise and a Romanian aesthetician's book on proportion. Corpus Hypercubus hangs today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, part of the Chester Dale collection, on public view among the museum's holdings of modern painting, where it remains one of the most frequently photographed and reproduced religious paintings of the 20th century, printed on book covers, lecture slides, and, increasingly, in the kind of mathematics classroom material used to explain what a Tesseract net actually looks like to students encountering the fourth dimension for the first time, a strange second life for a painting that began as an act of private religious conviction worked out in a fisherman's cottage on the Catalan coast. Visitors who stand in front of the canvas today overwhelmingly register it the way the gallery-going public of 1954 did, as a striking, luminous, faintly unsettling image of a floating Christ above a quiet harbor, the geometry of the cross absorbed as texture rather than read as argument. One more example of Dalí's talent for producing images strange enough to be memorable, without most viewers ever asking whether the strangeness could be checked against anything. That gap between what a painting is instantly felt to be and what it can, on inspection, be shown to be, sits at the center of how Dalí's late period has been reassessed in the decades since his death. For much of the 20th century, the standard account of his career divided cleanly into two acts. A first act of genuine, historically important surrealism, running roughly from the melting clocks of the early 1930s through his expulsion from Breton's circle, and a second act of commercial self-parody, mysticism, sold to a wealthy post-war audience hungry for spectacle with a religious veneer. Corpus Hypercubus complicates that division in a way few individual works from the so-called second act can. It is possible to find the nuclear mysticism period critically uneven, even to find much of Dalí's later religious output overworked or theatrical, without that judgment touching the narrower, checkable claim the cross in this specific painting makes, because that claim does not depend on taste. It depends on whether the 8 cubes, hinged where Dalí hinged them, belong to the set of 261 arrangements that a four-dimensional hypercube can be correctly unfolded into. They do. That fact does not settle whether Corpus Hypercubus is a great painting in every sense the word can carry, but it settles, permanently and independently of critical fashion, that the geometric intelligence on display in it was real, precise, and decades ahead of the instruments that would eventually be built to measure it. The next time you stand in front of Corpus Hypercubus, or in front of a reproduction of it on a page or a screen, the cross beneath Christ's floating body will read differently. What once looked like a shape chosen simply because it was strange enough for a surrealist audience already trained to expect strangeness from this particular painter will read instead as what it has always, provably, been, one correct answer out of 261, drawn by hand, in a fishing village on the Catalan coast, from a 16th century architect's forgotten treatise on cubes, 30 years before anyone else on Earth had the means to check the work. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.